On the morning of March 12, 1997, patrol officers arrived at a one-story house on the outskirts of a major American city. Two bodies lay in the kitchen, a man in his 40s and a teenager in his 17s. Semen stains were found on the teenager's collar. DNA testing later revealed their identity. A shotgun lay nearby, and blood dripped across the linoleum. At first glance, it seemed like an obvious murder-suicide, but investigators soon realized that something twisted and terrifying had long been afoot within this family. The Randall family lived quietly and unnoticed. The neighborhood was considered safe, and neighbors rarely interacted with one another. But everyone knew that the death of William Randall's wife had brought a sense of silence to the house. His wife, Susan, had died of cancer 2 years earlier. It was a devastating blow from which he never fully recovered. He quit his job at an insurance company, explaining to his colleagues that he needed time to take care of his son. His son, Jason, was a senior at the time. According to teachers, he was a calm and collected teenager, non-confrontational, diligent, and showed no signs of deviance. After his mother's funeral, he became even more withdrawn. His father rarely let him out of the house. At first, this seemed like a sign of concern. William accompanied his son to school, picked him up after classes, often cooked for him, and made sure he went to bed on time. Gradually, his concern turned into a constant presence. William began interfering with his son's studies, calling teachers, asking who he sat next to, and checking his homework. Neighbors recalled often seeing father and son standing for hours in the backyard, talking, sometimes arguing. Jason stopped participating in sports and stopped visiting friends. His phone calls were limited to short replies and soon ceased altogether. According to a school psychologist, the boy's behavior had changed. He became tense, irritable, and often glanced over his shoulder when speaking, as if he were wary of someone. When the psychologist suggested inviting his father for a conversation, William declined, saying that everything was under control and that the family was going through a natural period of adjustment after loss. Soon, adaptation turned into isolation. William almost never left the house. He ordered groceries for delivery and paid bills by mail. According to the postman, he sometimes heard loud conversations and sounds resembling arguments, but he dismissed them. The family was grieving the loss, and the emotions seemed natural. Rumors began circulating among neighbors that the father was preventing his son from interacting with his peers, and that he, in response, had become rude and irritable. However, no formal complaints were filed. Neither Jason nor William had broken the law. It all looked like a family in slow decline. The house, once well kept, began to fall into disrepair. The lawn wasn't mown, the windows weren't washed, the curtains were always closed. Only in the evenings, when the dim light in the living room was turned on, could you see the silhouettes of two people sitting opposite each other at the table. The psychological dependence between them became increasingly obvious. William, according to the few who saw him, spoke only of his son, of how he feared for him, how he wanted to save the family, how he wouldn't let his child suffer again. He seemed unaware that his actions were creating an atmosphere in which his son ceased to exist as an independent person. By the spring of 1996, Jason had virtually stopped leaving the house. William attributed this to homeschooling and claimed his son was preparing for college. In reality, the boy took no tests, received no diploma, and had no official mentor. All paperwork related to his education was filled out by his father himself. Social services showed no interest. The family aroused no suspicion, and there was no history of violence. But within the home, a gradual loss of boundaries, emotional, personal, and moral, occurred. With each passing month, the father became increasingly withdrawn from his son, and the son, in turn, became increasingly fearful of him. The first warning signs became noticeable to those around him. Only by the end of the year, Jason was no longer even seen at the window. When a neighbor tried to pass him his school books, William took them himself and said that the boy is unwell and resting. From then on, the house was completely silent. In January 1997, it seemed as if father and son had simply vanished from the life of the neighborhood. But behind the closed curtains, behind the peeling door, what investigators would later call a long process of relationship and personality degradation was already beginning. Everything that had been normal, school, friends, interests, was gone. Only two people remained, bound not by love, but by fear and dependence. By the spring of 1996, the Randall family home had become a completely enclosed space where the familiar landmarks of the outside world had vanished. Outside, a sagging fence, an overgrown yard, and the occasional footprint on the driveway. Inside, two people, between whom all human boundaries were gradually erased. William was the first to wake up. He rose early, around 5 in the morning, turned on the lights in every room, checked the locks, the shutters, the thermometer in the kitchen. Any irregularity, an open window, a forgotten mug, someone else's paper in the mailbox, caused him to worry. This worry quickly turned into a habit of controlling everything. Over time, control became an integral part of his existence. He noted what time his son entered the shower, how long he spent there, what things he took with him, how many sips of water he took at dinner. Jason lost track of where his father's care ended and his surveillance began. Any attempt at privacy aroused suspicion. His father would look for excuses to enter the room, to dust, to change a light bulb, to check the outlet. He would open his son's notebooks, inspect the bed, and sometimes sit next to him and simply watch while he did his homework. His father's presence was constant, even at night. Soon the very concept of personal space disappeared. Jason slept with the door half open. The bathroom was no longer locked. Any conversations with strangers, even with salespeople on the phone, were monitored. William began keeping the keys to his phone and mailbox in his pocket and intercepting calls. He claimed it was more peaceful that way. Over time, the obsession turned into a ritual. Every evening, they dined at the same time, at the same table. The food was placed on plates in a strictly symmetrical pattern. After dinner, there was family time, an obligatory time together in the living room. William would play old videos of his wife, smiling, young, before her illness. He forced his son to watch them, explaining that everything should be like it used to be. Sometimes he would repeat, "She would want us to be closer." From that moment on, the relationship ceased to be that of father and son. Normal interaction gave way to cold dependence. Jason could no longer resist. He didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't resist. Silence became his defense. He stopped expressing emotions, becoming a mechanical extension of his father's will. The world around him no longer existed. William slowly constructed his own frame of reference, one that encompassed only the two of them. He didn't perceive his son as a separate person. In his mind, Jason became something like an extension of his dead wife, something that held onto memory, physical closeness, and the familiarity of the other's presence. Gradually, the man's behavior became increasingly bizarre. He stopped washing his son's clothes separately and began buying identical items. Identical shirts, identical shoes. Duplicate items appeared in the house. 2 toothbrushes of the same color, 2 towels, 2 cups with identical cracks. William claimed this was a symbol of unity. For Jason, it was simply another way of erasing his identity. The psychological isolation intensified. My son stopped writing, stopped drawing. He used to sketch and love nature photography. Everything disappeared. Every attempt to regain privacy caused a quiet but palpable pressure. William didn't raise his voice or threaten, but his silence and gaze were more powerful than words. The surveillance became constant. He would stand in the doorway for several minutes without saying anything, simply observing how his son sat or breathed. At night, according to evidence later found in his journals, he would approach Jason's bed, checking to see if he was asleep or talking to himself. Entries in his father's diary, discovered by the investigators, pointed to an internal rationalization. He believed he was doing everything to save the family. He effectively turned the house into a laboratory of obsessive rituals. He didn't allow change. The furniture stood in the same places. The clock on the wall ticked to the second. Even the light bulb in the hallway was changed strictly on the same day of the week. Jason knew that any deviation from the routine would provoke a reaction, so he tried to anticipate his father's every move. This constant tension was exhausting. One day, as experts later determined, William decided that his son needed more closeness. He canceled his remaining rare calls to relatives and removed all photographs of his mother from their rooms, except for one on the nightstand in their shared bedroom. This move became a symbolic break with the past and a final descent into pathological dependence. Now the house was no longer a place to live. It had become a closed system, with rules, but no freedom. Jason began to lose track of time. Every day was the same, only rare changes. The thunder of the wind, the sound of dripping water in the bathtub, reminded him of the world beyond the walls. The father's mental state gradually devolved into obsession. According to his diaries, he saw in his son a reflection of himself mixed with her features. For him, Jason ceased to be a child. He was a symbol, a comfort, an object meant to fill an inner void. When this void ceased to be filled by words, it began to demand presence, constant, physical, inseparable. Then the addiction entered the next stage, which forensic psychiatrists would later describe as a borderline state between loss of identity and an attempt to recreate the lost connection through role reversal. By this point, everyone had completely lost sight of the family. William no longer answered calls or appeared on the street. Jason hadn't been seen since last summer. There were no lights in the house, only occasional flickers, as if a television was on in the night. A silence was growing inside, heavy as anticipation, and this silence slowly paved the way for what was to come. By the summer of 1996, the boundaries that once separated reality from William's inner world had all but disappeared. Nothing in the house was left random. Everything had meaning, every detail and element of his personal system. Where order replaced meaning, he began making schedules, not to enforce discipline, but to control his son's existence as a function. A chart hung on the wall, minute by minute noting Jason's actions, eating, sleeping, moving around the house. The blank spaces irritated his father. He filled them in himself, imagining he knew what his son was doing. Jason barely spoke. His body existed apart from his will, and even a step down the hallway became an act requiring caution. Any violation of his father's rules was perceived as a betrayal. Psychological isolation became physical. His father didn't allow his son to be alone, following him, breathing close, touching his shoulder, straightening his hair, checking his clothes. He called it care, but beneath these gestures, one sensed not care, but an attachment, thick and clinging. William stood by his son's bedside for long periods of time at night, awake, listening to his breathing. Sometimes he sat in the chair opposite to make sure he was there. Jason feigned sleep, feeling his father's gaze slowly sweep over him, registering his every movement. He lost the distinction between day and night. The lights turned on at his father's command. The air smelled of his clothes and old alcohol. The density of his presence became suffocating. By this time, Jason's body had begun to react to the constant stress. He began experiencing insomnia, stomach pains, and loss of appetite. His skin had turned pale, and his fingers were trembling. But William saw this not as an illness, but as a signal of need. He sat next to him for long periods, holding his son's hands, justifying it as a need to keep him warm. These touches grew longer and longer. They lost their neutrality, and this was the turning point. Gradually, William's father began to break down the familiar patterns of everyday life. They ate together, from the same dishes. They sat too close. They slept in the same room, not out of fear of loneliness, as he explained, but because he felt it was the only way to stay connected. It was as if William had replaced his feelings of guilt with the ritual of physical presence. He touched his son the way he had once touched his wife, automatically, without passion, but with an obsessive desire to make up for the loss. The journal he kept, later discovered, revealed a fractured mindset, phrases about purification through unity, about returning to the family's origins, about blood merging. It all seemed like a desperate attempt to justify the irreparable. Jason wasn't a participant, but a part of an alien construct created by a sick mind. Over time, the resistance disappeared. The son no longer protested or tried to leave. He lived by inertia, responding to commands. Every day became a repetition of the same ritual: food, silence, a look, a touch. His body responded with habit, his mind with numbness. He no longer knew where pain ended and fear began. Violating boundaries became a daily occurrence. William stopped seeing his son as a person. His perception shifted. He was now an image, a hybrid of the memory of his wife and the fear of loneliness. It combined pity and dominance, care and obsession. He could stare at Jason's face for hours, as if checking to see if his features had changed, if the resemblance to the dead woman had disappeared. When physical intimacy no longer provided the illusion of peace, he moved on to new rituals. Documents reveal that several weeks before the tragedy, William completely removed the locks from his doors, removed the mirror from the bathroom, and screwed metal bars to his beds to hold the structure together. All of this created a sense of imprisonment, but for him, it seemed like a way to control the chaos that had taken up residence in his head. Jason began to lose his mind. He ate without taste, drank without thirst, and moved slowly, as if underwater. His inner disgust at what was happening melted into indifference, then into a hidden determination. When the mind can't change its circumstances, it searches for a way out. That way out was close by, in the closet where he kept an old hunting shotgun that had belonged to his grandfather. By mid-February 1997, the balance had completely collapsed. The house had become a silent organism, feeding on fear. The father wandered the rooms, talking to himself. His son watched his every move, knowing that any touch could be the ultimate limit of his patience. Everything was moving toward its end, slowly, inexorably, without a cry. February 1997 marked the last month of the Randall house's existence as a livable space. There was no sense of life inside, only the mechanical actions repeated daily. The air was heavy, damp, saturated with the smell of moldy walls and stale tobacco. The electricity frequently went out, and the lights flickered, as if responding to the internal tension building within the house. William barely slept. His body was exhausted, but his mind continued to operate in a warped state, a combination of anxiety and fanatical control. He wrote notes, clipped newspaper headlines about family tragedies, and kept them in a drawer under his bed. His notes included phrases about salvation through purification and the need to keep blood close. Psychiatrists would later describe these as symptoms of an acute psychotic state, accompanied by hallucinatory thinking. By this point, Jason no longer perceived what was happening as reality. His consciousness was divided into two parts, an external, obedient one, and an internal, detached one. He moved as if following a script written by someone else. His hands trembled. His gaze was empty. His state became close to catatonia. His body reacted, but his mind retreated ever deeper. In such a state, fear ceases to be an emotion. It becomes the environment in which a person lives. William spent more and more time nearby. He demanded his presence. Even in his sleep, the son lay motionless, feeling his father's breath on him. At some point, this contact ceased to be simply a physical manifestation of dependence. It became an act of complete submission. The resistance disappeared, but in its place, a different feeling arose, a quiet determination, growing out of fatigue and despair. One evening, William picked up an old photo album. The pictures depicted his family, his wife, his son, summer walks, and seaside trips. He spent a long time examining the photographs, then shoving them into new envelopes, making notes. It seemed he was preparing an archive, as if he foresaw the end. The next day, he bought new candles, washed the floor, and put things back in their proper places. It all seemed like preparation, unconscious, yet consistent. The son watched this in stupefaction. His mind was in standby mode. He understood that the situation was irreversible, that there was no escape. Everything that was happening resembled a final act, protracted and inevitable. The house was silent, broken only by his father's footsteps and the occasional click of a lighter. Something happened on the night of March 10th to 11th that none of the investigators could determine. According to forensic evidence, the father behaved calmly and showed no aggression. 2 cups with the remains of cold coffee and an ashtray with cigarette butts were found on the table. Everything indicated that they had spent the evening together, silently, without words, but in the same dense atmosphere of dependence. After midnight, William lay down on the sofa in the living room. His son remained in his room. He opened the closet and took out a hunting shotgun, a rifle his father had kept as a memento of his childhood. The weapon was loaded. An autopsy revealed the shot had been fired from close range while standing. The bullet struck the father in the chest. Death was instantaneous. The son didn't run. He didn't scream. He didn't try to call. He sat down next to him, placed the gun on his lap, and sat motionless for a few minutes. Then he reloaded the shotgun and aimed the barrel at his forehead. The second shot rang out a few minutes later. Neighbors heard a loud bang, but thought nothing of it. It wasn't until the morning, when the postman saw the door open and called, but heard no answer, that he called the police. Investigators described the scene as unusually calm for a double homicide. The bodies lay close together. The room was neat, with no signs of a struggle. A clock ticked on the wall, stopping 20 minutes after the shooting. An open notebook remained on the table. My father's last entry was dated the previous day. It contained the words, "When everything comes together, pain will no longer be an emptiness." The son wrote nothing. Only the blood that flowed onto the floor formed a dark line dividing the room, like a boundary they had long been unable to draw in life. For the investigators, the case seemed simple. The motive was despair. The consequences were the deaths of both. But the documents attached to the case contained a note: disruption of the family structure, resulting in the collapse of identity. The phrase was dry and formal, but it contained all that remained of the story. The house was sealed. A week later, the belongings were removed, the walls were repainted, and the gunshot wounds were patched up. New residents moved in the spring. None of them knew that beneath the fresh paint still lingered the shadow of what had once happened in this house, where love and fear became indistinguishable. The investigation began on the morning of March 12th. The task force documented a standard pattern for a murder-suicide, but soon details began to emerge in the case file that didn't fit the usual mold. Old bruises and cuts unrelated to the gunshot wound were discovered on the father's body. His son's body bore abrasions on his wrists and collarbones that had healed long before the tragedy. These marks indicated a long period of hidden violence and subjugation, leaving no external evidence. Jason's room was empty. No personal belongings, no photographs, no books. On his desk lay only a ruler and a sheet of paper with a single phrase scrawled on it: "When love becomes observation, it ceases to be love." Handwriting experts confirmed the inscription was his son's. During a search of the attic, investigators found a box of tapes. On them, William recorded voices, footsteps, breathing, and random phrases from his son. Some recordings lasted for several hours. Forensic experts determined that they had been going on for almost a year. On the final tapes, only breathing was audible, slow and measured, as if the father were watching his sleeping son. A forensic psychiatric report, compiled a month later, documented William's signs of profound mental deterioration, manifested in obsessive patterns of control and a disrupted sense of personal boundaries. His consciousness gradually shifted toward ritualistic thinking, where morality and law lost their significance. Psychiatrists concluded that he was experiencing progressive attachment delusions, triggered by the loss of his wife. Jason's story was different. Experts described him as a victim of systemic psychological domination who had lost the ability to resist. The documents noted that his suicide was not an act of despair, but the logical conclusion of a long-term addiction in which death was perceived as the only escape from total control. The case was never brought to court. There were no culprits. Investigators closed the case file after 2 months, leaving several dozen pages of reports, photographs of the scene, and expert notes in the archives. The senior investigator's report concluded, "No external circumstance explains the internal emptiness that caused the disaster." The house was sold 8 months later. The new owners replaced the windows, refloored the floors, and tore down the wall between the bedrooms. But the local newspaper only carried a brief note: "Once again, Faro Street has seen a change of tenants." Thus ended a story that began with care and ended in the destruction of a person. The case materials remain in the archives under number 97-214, a reminder that sometimes a crime begins not with a gunshot, but from the moment when love ceases to be a boundary and becomes a closed cage.